This session today is one where I would ask you, if you want to keep track of what's on the screen, do take notes, because I am a minister in the Church of Scotland, but I'm here today really representing the charity that I work for the other half of the week, Child Bereavement UK, and all the slides that I'm using are part of our training, and so they won't be available after the session today because they're all copyrighted. I will tell you about where you can get other resources. My colleague Katie, who I'll make stand up just now, Katie's here today, and we have a stall through in the main hall, and there's lots of leaflets and resources there that you can come and see and take away with you. And we'll also do a wee bit about the website at the end where you can get further resources too. So if there's anything that comes up that you think about, then please do take notes, because I know some people at the previous session that we were at were relying on the fact that the slides would be available afterwards, so these won't because of those copyright reasons. But I hope that what we'll do today is engage in a way that enables us to ask some questions of ourselves and the congregations that we represent. Because sometimes at conferences it's really lovely to meet with people and to have lots of conversations and to tell stories, and to tell stories about where you're from and what you're doing. But we've only got an hour, so I would encourage you not to go into big anecdotes when we do split into discussion, but to try and stay critical today, constructively critical, in a way where we say, what can we do? What can we look at in our churches? What does this make us think about, and how can we apply it? So, does that make sense? Not to go into, oh, I knew somebody that happened to, or oh, that reminds me of a time when this happened to me, but to go into a bit where we think, what could we do in our churches? What's the question that we need to be living with around this aspect of pastoral care? So, my name's Gayle Taylor, and I've been a minister for 19 years, and I've been a parish minister before I came to be the associate with a special remit for children and young people in Edinburgh, where I am just now, where I've been for 9 years. And since last July, I went part-time in that job to work the other half of the week in the Royal Children's Hospital in Glasgow as a bereavement support practitioner, as part of a team of 4 people setting up a pioneering service for parents who've lost a child. And you'll see these 3 logos up on the screen here, which explains to you how that service came about. It was commissioned by the NHS because they saw a real need as York Hill moved over to the new Queen Elizabeth site, and then funding from parents who had lost a child in the past in York Hill was made available through the Children's Hospital charity for a bereavement service, and then a tender was put out, and Child Bereavement UK, as a charity who have a lot of resources and capacity, were the ones who got the contract. So we're triple branded in that sense, and if you're from Glasgow, you can find out a lot more about what we do. I'll also speak a wee bit about Katie's service that she works in Glasgow as well. This is the aims of our session this morning. We're going to do 4 things, hopefully. We're going to think a wee bit about death and dying, not about palliative care as we've been looking at in some of the other sessions that are on today, but a little bit about death itself. So it's not going to be an easy session, so we're going to try and look after ourselves within that too, but we're going to look a wee bit about our attitudes towards death and dying and how things have changed. We're going to look at particularly the awareness of the needs of bereaved children. We're going to look at feedback from families, because one of the other things I want us to keep an eye on today is the fact that when there is a bereavement, it affects the whole family. And if you get the Learn publication today, I have a section that I've written in that, and part of the pastoral care for children around bereavement is that I want to make sure that when ministers or elders go to visit a family who have been bereaved, you always check how the kids are doing too. Because sometimes we go and we speak to the people that we're arranging the funeral with, but we don't always think about children, and we don't ask, are they going to the funeral? What's happening for them? What's their understanding? Is this their first experience of bereavement? So it's about looking after the whole family, and we want to hear some key messages from bereaved families that will help us to know why that's important. And then Katie and I have just sat in at the self-care session with Gabby, and hands up anyone else that was in at that. Good. So we're going to follow on nicely from that about how we take care of ourselves around bereavement and the bereavement pastoral care that we do. Hands up if you've ever heard of Child Bereavement UK before. Good. It's really big down south, like a lot of charities, it started in England. It started in England just after the death of Princess Diana, when there was a big awareness about these two young boys, William and Harry, who had lost their mother and who were made to follow the coffin in front of the whole nation. And our whole psyche started to change about how we understood children in bereavement. And one of our founders and patrons is one of their godmothers. And so Child Bereavement UK was set up, first of all, about children who were bereaved and their experience of losing a parent or carer. The service that I am involved in the hospital is for parents who've lost a child, so the other side of child bereavement. And then the third aspect of the work that the charity does is training for professionals. So we're working with hospices, we're working with the prison service, we're working with the emergency services, we're working with ministers and chaplains, we're working with schools to help anyone who in their job is coming into contact with people who are bereaved. And if you're a professional in any of those areas or in other areas where you're saying we deal with bereavement quite a lot, we can come in and offer staff training. And another part of the work that I do in the hospital is staff support for all of the medical teams who are regularly coming into contact with bereavement and speaking to people about that. These are some statistics from the last big UK report that we commissioned that speak about, that speak about the need for the work of Child Bereavement UK. So that's just a wee bit about who we are and what we do. And I now want to, sorry, this is jumping a wee bit. I now just want to say in the room here today that we're going to talk about some things that are difficult. And if you yourself have been going through a time of grieving recently, if it's something that's been affecting you or your family, I've put up the hand gel there because I work in the hospital, and hand gel is something that we use 6, 7, 8 times a day as you move in and out of different places, and it's a way of making sure that you're protecting yourself and others around germs. So I want you to protect yourself this morning. It's a difficult subject, it's a heavy subject, so I don't mind at all if anyone wants to leave the room, or if you feel afterwards that you need to have a chat with ourselves. We'll be at the stall too, so just do what you need to do to look after yourself if this is something that's particularly close for you just now. Because when we're working with families who are grieving, we bring ourselves. We bring our own hurts and our own losses. We bring our own feelings about loss by death. It gives us a real awareness of our mortality. We bring our desire to care for others. Now, working in the hospital, one of the things that I find regularly is that healthcare professionals are people who are there to make it better, and they're there to fix things. When somebody dies, you can't fix it, and you can't make it better. You might say things that make a difference. You might be able to show people that you're there for them, but you can't change what they're going through. It's a finality experience, and when you go through it with people, there's nothing that you can do that makes it better, and that's very hard for some of us to sit with, depending on our jobs in the past or our personalities even. When we work with grieving families, we also bring that sense of wanting to do as much as we can to reach out and to involve ourselves. And if you were at the self-care workshop before, it's that wee bit about sometimes we can overextend ourselves, and it's important that we remember it's not our grief. We might be able to relate and empathise, but it's about that person. Many of the families that I work with in Glasgow in the hospital who've lost a child will tell me that one of the worst things for them to cope with when they start to speak to people after the initial terrible weeks maybe, is when people say, I know what that's like because it happened to my sister-in-law, or it happened to a lady in my street, or I know a family in the school. And people say, it's hard enough coping with our own grief without having to hear about other people's as well. So, focused on the person, even though we want to reach out and involve ourselves and say, I can relate to this a wee bit, we must remember that it's their grief. And of course, it's hard for us to sit then with this feeling of inadequacy and inability to do anything that transforms that situation for people in that moment. We feel overpowered by the horror or the tragedy of death, and we can feel overwhelmed by our own sadness. And often that can lead into that initial bit when we meet someone who's grieving, where we say, I just didn't know what to say. What do I say? I felt I put my foot in it. And we're going to look at that a wee bit this afternoon, sorry. So, this is a wee bit for our first learning outcome, which is a wee bit about how attitudes and thinking around death have changed. This is a photograph from the Victorian era, and I wonder what you notice about it when we put it up. The coffin's there, right at the front. Well done. I did this in the hospital with a group of doctors, this photograph, and after about 10 minutes somebody said, oh, there's a coffin! So, well done, you noticed it straight away. They were so busy looking at all the people at the back and what they were wearing and things that they missed that fact right at the front. What else do you notice about it? Children. Right at the coffin, at the open coffin, yeah. Anything else?
They're actually getting their photograph taken with the coffin.
There we go. Yeah, so in the Victorian era, people didn't have a lot of photographs. They just really started, and so this was an occasion where you thought, yeah, let's get a photograph of this, because they would have their family gathered, they'd have all the generations there. It was a time to capture that family portrait, and of course you would have the dead person in it as well, and everybody would be dressed in their finery, so people thought, yeah, let's get a photograph. Would we do that now? Some cultures do.
Not with the couple,
yeah.
But with the people.
Maybe the mourners.
Not
yeah.
necessarily the couple.
Depends where you come from. So my grandmother was Belgian, and when she died, her relatives came over to Scotland for the funeral and took photographs of the grave and the coffin going into the grave for those that were back at home. And I remember my mum going, oh no, this is terrible and embarrassing. So it depends what culture you come from. And also, I think nowadays, if you speak to a lot of younger people, I know we have somebody from the Youth Assembly here with us this morning, but a lot of younger people would talk about selfies now, and there have been a lot of things on the news about young people taking selfies at funerals. Now that's just about a change in culture and mindset, where young people take photos of everything they do. Like they take photos of their dinner and, you know, just this is what I'm doing today. So it's a bit about documenting. And so some of the cultural norms and things that happen in society are changing. So let's have a wee look at that. When people were mourning in the past, we knew they were mourning because there were certain rituals that they went through to show that they were in a time of grief and mourning. People wore black armbands. You know, the Black Widows would wear, you know, their outfit for 2 years usually. And with the passing of time, our media has changed greatly. And so that does mean that we're contending with a lot more in terms of rituals around death in society. So Diana was the big sea change in our country, where a lot of people said that attitudes towards funerals and death and dying changed. Since then, things have just kept going. And one of the biggest things that happens is that people put all their flowers down at the site of where somebody's died. That happened around the Diana time. And now, when people die, another huge thing that happens is that instantly people go on and post tributes on Facebook. So I'm a school chaplain, and in the schools where sadly we've had a young person die, it's very difficult for schools to police their communications policy, and because straight away pupils just go straight on, and suddenly a tribute page on the person, their Facebook page becomes a tribute page. So lots of different things that have changed around our attitudes to death and dying. But the other big thing that I want to point out from this photograph is that it's outside a house. And in some cultures, I know like in Shetland and other places up north, it might still be similar to this, but on the whole, death has moved away from something that happens at home and something that was part of family life in the same way that birth happened at home and was part of family life. And it has moved into hospitals and hospices, and even when we come to the funeral itself, my own experience as a minister is that mostly crematoriums now, not as many burials as there used to be. That's been the trend. And when we're in a crematorium, a hospital or a hospice, everything around death has been sanitised. Everything has become something that we don't touch, we're not so fully involved in for a big period of time. But I think that that's starting to change too, in that we're recognising that psychologically and spiritually the need for people to spend time with those who are dying and those who have died is really important. Is there anyone here who's a midwife or who's worked in neonatal maternity? You have, yep. So huge changes, for example, it was just recently in October Baby Loss Awareness Week. And there was a lot on the news about that, and that's a big part of our work in the hospital. Is parents who've lost a child. Very often it's a child that's a stillbirth or a child that's died just not too long after birth. And of course, in the past, what happened when babies died were they were taken away straight away, and we had things like communal graves. And the way that we dealt with the loss of a child in the past was that way of kind of trying to sanitise it and get it over and done with. Now, there's a huge sea change around memory making, memory boxes, things like Simba and Sands and Tommy, all these charities that have grown up out of the recognition that people need to take time with their grief and need to spend time with their child that did and does exist for them as part of their family. So I know, for example, the congregation that I work in now knit the blankets for the memory boxes. A lot of our women do that, and that's been a huge awareness raising exercise for some of our older knitters, because they're realising it is for babies, that the blanket is wrapped around the baby, but there's also a blanket that the parents keep after the funeral. And lots of these women, probably in their 70s and 80s, said, when it happened to me, there was nothing like that. That's a huge ministry if we can start helping people to see that we've moved on, and we've moved on for a reason. And some people, we have this thing in the hospital, it's a tree where people put a leaf, an engraved leaf on the tree, and the hospital's only been there for 3 years, and there's a couple of leaves on that tree that are from 1946. And that's because people come back and they want to find a record of their baby that was born, and they want to put up a leaf on the tree now. So people don't forget, and they don't move on, and they don't get over it. But it's about how we have those conversations and help people to acknowledge their grief that is lifelong. And then let's have a think about how belief and faith come into that. I work in schools where we do the Curriculum for Excellence, which is about all faiths and none. Hands up anyone who works in schools, retired teachers or staff support, any of these things. Great. So you'll know yourself that in schools we can't always just talk about religion without being careful around that and without being clear about what we're doing. It's the same in hospitals too, all faiths and none. And we must have a think about what means something to people when they come to that crossroads of life and death. Sometimes people will say, I'm not religious at all, but the minute their child is dying, they'll say, I want a priest, I want a minister, I want to light a candle, I want to say a prayer. Other people who will say, no, absolutely not, I don't want any of that, please don't send the chaplain to me. So being really sensitive to the layers of people's upbringing and understanding around faith and spirituality is important. And for all of us, again, when we bring ourselves into dealing with people who are bereaved, we must recognise that we all come from a family culture. So the way you do stuff in your family will be different from the way that I do stuff in my family. We might come from a family who are big huggers, you know. We love to be very tactile and demonstrative, and other people say, oh, a bit too much, I'm quite private, please don't touch me. So we mustn't assume that, you know, that's part of what you do when somebody's bereaved. You give them a hug, you hold their hand. We must, you know, just be sensitive to that. And people revert to different cultural mechanisms when they're grieving. So it'd be really interested, you know, ministers in the room, you'll know that when you come to, or elders who conduct funerals, when you come to take a funeral, suddenly people will pick hymns and readings that, you know, they've never been to church, but they just know about this thing. You know, the Lord's my shepherd is an amazing touchstone for so many people. It just brings them comfort, and it's something that people get a lot of comfort from singing, even if they haven't been to church. So there's things that people revert to, and you might want to say to them, where's that come from? What's that about? Not just, oh yes, Lord's my shepherd, we know why you're having that. Ask them, what does it mean to you? How is that part of your culture and your experience? And we mustn't ever assume. We had a doctor in the hospital who said to me at one point, as part of our bereavement care, we've got a handbook, and we find out if the person is Jewish or Muslim or Christian or whatever, and in the handbook we open it up and we see what each of those religions does around the time of death and around, you know, marking someone's passing. And I said, well, that's nice to have that, you know, you've done a wee bit of research there, but somebody could be a very liberal Jew or an Orthodox Jew, somebody could, you know, be from a particular denomination of Christianity. The biggest thing that you can do is ask. You know, because people have their preferences, their own experiences. We can't assume that because someone comes from a particular faith or a particular denomination within our own faith that they're going to do things in a certain way. So ask people, what's important to you? And I think in this day and age of all faiths and none in schools and in hospitals, it's about language sometimes. We're talking about the same thing, but the words that we use are really important. So, I would like you to work with your neighbour, or if you can do it in threes, that's quite nice too. Try and speak to people that you didn't come in with as well, that's always good. This is our discussion point 1 on our first learning outcome, which is about how attitudes have changed, our attitudes towards death and dying. And the first discussion point that I want to ask you to get you to ask with your neighbours and to talk about for a couple of minutes is, what does all that mean for the church? The changes in attitudes to death and dying. What does that mean for the church? 3 or 4 minutes, on you go with your neighbour. Thank you. Thanks very much for engaging with that, and I'm hoping if we can remember not just to go into anecdotes and stories about what's happened, but to try and keep on this question. What does it mean for us? What can we do? How can we apply it? I'm going to keep moving because we've got these 4 learning outcomes and we need to try and get through them all, but there'll be space at the end hopefully, and also, as I said, we're at the stall today. The next bit is that particularly looking about how we support children. Who works with children in this room? Okay. Who's got children in their congregation? Good. Who's got children in their family? Great, so this is relevant to everyone. And that's the thing, when I do this kind of training in schools and in the hospital, I say not only are you going to become better professionals, I hope you're going to become better people as well, because this is about things that we can apply in our lives. And what I wanted to say is, just as we've talked about, let's not get a handbook for all the different faith traditions and assume that we know what each person wants. Let's not assume that grief is uniform. Grief is unique, feels different to me than it would to you. And so when people say, I mean, how long do you think it's normal for me to feel like this? You'll feel like that for as long as you need to feel like that, and you might always feel like that to some extent. And so when we're talking to children, we want to remember that first bit, and some of this will be about adults too. We're going to look at, you know, what happens for children, but you know, we're all children of God, and we're all going to experience a lot of this, and we might even remember when we were children, when we experienced grief in our own family. So that's what I mean about looking after yourself today. It'll touch on different aspects of that. There are as many ways to grieve as there are children in the world, but grief is compounded by the circumstances of grief. So these are things that affect the grief process. So obviously, grief will have a particular shape and colour to it if somebody has been terminally ill. And so I know that that's one of the other workshops today that's going to look about a gradual loss of a person, or if someone's had a life-changing illness that they've been carrying until they die. So we're looking at dementia as well today for that reason. Very different from somebody going out and being killed in a road traffic accident very suddenly. So we're looking at trauma, we're looking at, I mean, you're never prepared for somebody dying, but you know, there's a different level of expectation when you know that it's something that's coming when somebody's terminally ill or somebody who is killed in an accident. So think about that for children too. The relationship with the person who died, this is one that is, again, tricky. We must never assume that because somebody's mother's died, that, oh well, the mother-child bond, of course, that's going to be terrible, your mother's died. Similarly, for a child, oh well, it was just your granny or your great-granny, because actually, mum might not have been a great mum, or dad might not have been a great dad, and maybe they had a bit of an ambiguous relationship with them, or maybe they had an abusive relationship with them, maybe they had a very distant relationship where they didn't see them very often, and maybe granny was the person who picked them up from school every day, or who looked after them at the weekends, or who did the lion's share of the childcare. So we don't assume that the biological or the named relationships mean what they maybe mean to us. And then obviously our individual personality and background, we've talked a wee bit about that already. Why do things mean what they mean to us? What's our experience? Are we demonstrative people, quiet people, shouty people? What are we like? That's going to affect it. And the other big thing for us, a lot of our work that we do in our service in Maryhill in Glasgow for families and in our hospital service is about the recovery environments, because a lot of families that we see have come from particularly chaotic and difficult backgrounds in the first place, and then you add a bereavement into that, so you can imagine what happens. So that might be the case in some of your areas of work too. This is a tiny bit here about the theories of grief. Anyone heard of any of these guys up on the screen? Oh, well, that's fine. I'll just skip the next 6 slides. The one I want to talk to you about is the last one, called Strobe and Shoot, and that's the, so Freud you know about, and Warden you know about, the tasks of mourning, that says that grief's not just something that happens to us, it's something that has work to be done within it. You know, it works through us and we have work to do, so there's different tasks of mourning. That's what Warden said. But the dual process model is one that we work with in our bereavement support sessions with parents, and it's really helpful for couples in particular who come for support. And it's all about how basically, yes, people grieve differently, but on the whole, that these two guys, Strobe and Shoot in Holland, they did a survey of 500 couples who had lost a child, and they discovered that pretty much unanimously across the 500, men and women grieve differently. Now, this explains a lot, so I'll go through it very quickly with you. The yellow circle is the grief, so if you imagine a couple, they're both grieving, it's a shared grief. However, the two smaller circles within that are things that both people need to do, but it tends to be that one of the partner, and this has also been studied now in same-sex couples, that, you know, it might not just be a gender thing, but it might be that one partner does one and one does the other. So one does the restoration side, which is the restoring of routine, the restoring of normality, the going back to work. So this explains why men generally tend to go back to work more quickly than women, how they get on with things. They keep, you know that expression when you're grieving, you say, I'm fine as long as I keep busy? That's this side of it. You distract yourself from your grief. You avoid your grief. You say, if I just keep going and I don't think about it, I'll be fine. And people throw themselves into new roles and identities and relationships. People go and start dating within a week sometimes when their partner's died, and people say, how could you do that? Or people go bungee jumping and start skydiving for charities. And a big thing in our line of work, as I've said, is in the hospital, which has been a great thing because it's moved on our attitudes to death and dying. People set up charities. So many people set up charities. And you think, where are they getting the energy to do that when they've just lost a child? It's all to do with this. Doing new things, new roles, new identity, new relationship. The other side of it is the loss. It's the sitting with that deep, dark pool of despair. I had a dad recently who lost his wee boy who's 6, and he said to me, I can see it. It's like a big, dark pit, and I'm frightened that if I go into it, I'll never come back out. It's a dark and scary and really frightening, really disillusioning place to be. And so why wouldn't you want to stay out of it? Why wouldn't you want to distract yourself in any way? Anything that just gives you a moment of relief or just makes you feel a wee bit better. Why wouldn't you want to do that to avoid sitting with the pain of that loss? However, we need to do the pain of the loss. That's one of the tasks of mourning, is to process the pain of the loss. We need to sit with our grief. We need to talk about the person that died. We need to look at some of our feelings. We'll try not to even acknowledge the denial parts of it. People who say, I just don't want to believe that it happened because it's so difficult. Part of our work is we do a quite cruel to be kind thing where we say to people, you need to say the word died. You need to say, this person is not here anymore, they have died, not they passed away or they're a star in heaven or any of these things. It's final. And only by accepting the reality of that loss can people start to process the next bit of their grief. When people sit in that side of their grief, they talk about the person all the time, they cry all the time, they're on a heap on the floor, they might not even get out of bed. It's a duvet day. Every day is a duvet day for a long time. And so on the whole, this study showed that women did much more of this, particularly in the early days, and men did more of that. And can you imagine that in a couple? Going, does he not care? He's away back to his work. And him going, I can't get her out of bed, you know? We've got other kids that need up and dressed and taken to school, and she won't get out of bed. So you can imagine how difficult that is for a relationship. And we talk about how the death of a child can make or break a relationship. It can also make or break your faith. So what we do as bereavement support practitioners is explain to couples about this, to give them permission for grieving in their different ways, but we also try and support them in doing this red line, which is the oscillating line that says you both need to do both. The living goes on at the same time as the grieving. You've got to keep body and soul together. I sit with people and say, I know that putting your feet on the floor out of the bed is the hardest bit of the day, but can you put your feet on the floor? Can you get up? Can you take a shower? People don't do that for weeks. Can you have something to eat? Can you put the heating on? We'll talk through that with people, and these are capable people, people who do, you know, serious jobs, who manage all the time, but suddenly when there's a bereavement, the floor's taken from under them, and you need to retrain them in how to function again. So remember that that's what people are going through when they're grieving. And we try and help people by supporting them when you can do things on a good day, when you can do the get showered, get dressed, go out to the shops, go to work, do it. But there's other days when you might be in this bit where we need to just sit with you in your pain and your loss and support you and just sit with you, accompany you in that. Really important model that helps us for these reasons. Now the interesting thing, when we remember that children grieve too, and people will say, oh, they're so young it didn't affect them. That's never true. Children do that dual process model really, really instinctively. I wonder if you've ever told a child about the death of somebody in your family, maybe as happened in my family. My brother-in-law's mother died at the beginning of the year, and when my two nephews were told, one of them went, oh, Gran's died. Can I play the Xbox? I mean, it's amazing. It's like instant. And then imagine you're those parents, that couple who've lost a child, and you're explaining to your child, this is what's happened to your wee sister. And they say, all right, okay, that's sad. What's for my tea tonight? Can I go out and play with so-and-so after tea? That's them doing that bit. Life goes on, and I'm sad. And they're saying to you instinctively, that's as much of the sad bit as I can take for now. Now I need to do the living. We call it puddle jumping, because kids jump in and out of their grief. And so you might be an adult who thinks, I want to sit down and have a big 20-minute conversation with a child about this death, and they're going, no, Xbox, no, tea, because I've done that sad bit just now. But later on, they'll come back and say, what happens when you die? Where is my wee sister? They'll ask you when they need to know. So there's a bit there about being led by them, not pushing. There's not a right or wrong way to do it. We need to be very attentive and responsive. And then when we are responsive, it's really important that we tell the truth. We do things as adults sometimes to try and protect children, to sugarcoat it, children are wise. They come back to you and they say, you told me that, but actually my friend at school told me this, and you told me that, but how does that work if that happens? We had a few years ago in Glasgow that our Mary Hill colleagues told us a story about, unfortunately in Mary Hill we've had quite a few homicides and drugs-related deaths that have affected families, and they were told about a wee boy whose dad had hung himself. And his mum thought she was doing the right thing by saying, your dad's heart just stopped. And then he went back to school, and everybody at school knew about it. And they'd said, no, it didn't, your dad's heart didn't stop. And then what does that do to that relationship with that mum? So we must think about that if we're involved in children's lives, if we're aunties, uncles, grands, teachers, elders, Sunday school teachers, all of that. Being careful about what we say and giving enough accurate information in an understandable manner so that the child can answer how and why if their friends ask them, how come you've not been at school? Why did that happen? They know themselves. I'm going to go through this bit quite quickly. I'm sure most of you all know a lot about this, but this is a bit very easily to sum that up. I'll say this is about you explain in an age-appropriate way to children. You wouldn't give a 3-year-old a 50-piece jigsaw to do. You would give them maybe a 6-piece jigsaw to do. So use your language carefully around how you explain things. So, like I said, a bereavement, a death of a parent or a carer, affects children of all ages, right through from a baby. You think it wouldn't, but they have that sense that that caregiver, that smell, that sound, that feeling is not there. We've got lots of resources on this that you can access through the website and also through our stall today, which is all about, you know, if you know a child at a particular age, if you work with a particular age group of children in the church, we can tell you. Magical thinking age, I always find that fascinating. That's the stage where kids believe things like Santa and the tooth fairy and all of that. They're able to invest in that kind of magical thinking, but they also then maybe think that when something happens it was their fault, that they did something. A wee girl whose dad was killed in a car accident, the last thing she remembered in the morning was that her dad was saying to her, hurry up, finish your cornflakes, come on, we need to get going. And she believed, as she started acting out quite a few months later, she believed that if she'd hurried up that morning he wouldn't have had that accident. So they sometimes believe cause and effect in a kind of magical thinking way, and we need to check out what's going on in kids' heads. Teenagers have it really rough because it's a time when everything's changing anyway for them as they go through puberty, and lots of questions and lots of need for support if they can get it at that time too. So, as I say, we've got lots on that we can come back to later. And what I want us to be aware of as people who work in the church is that as part of the wider community, there is a ripple effect when there's a loss. Everybody's talking about it. Sometimes we label people, don't we? We say that's that girl whose wee brother died. That's that family, you know, that happened. We're doing it in a nice way often, but they know that people have now labelled them because of the experience they've gone through. And it's all change. Sometimes people have to move away, or sometimes there's a change in what the childcare is. All of these things. Perspective on life, massive change for families in a bereavement. If you work in schools, schools are great at that time because schools offer consistency to kids, no matter what's going on at home. They offer a space, they offer a routine, they offer that normality where it's time away from what's going on. And so sometimes it's really good for kids to go back to school. People will say, oh no, keep them off, but sometimes it's really good, and it's a place where they get understanding and support. So, key thing about speaking to children, honesty is the best policy. Know that you can answer how and why. And here are the things that children in this year of young people, really important. This is what children really appreciate. And wee clue here, helping us to remember the person who's died, and memorials and rituals. If the children are not going to the funeral, could they do something else? Could they let off a balloon? Could they write a card that goes to the funeral? Could they come to the funeral tea? Could they do something in the church another time? How do we help people to express what's going on, not just at the time of the funeral? So, very quickly, just for a minute or two, this is your next discussion point. Having thought about children and having thought about families, let's think about this question. What does this mean for the church? Have a quick chat to your neighbour. Great to hear so much chat. I hope that means you're starting to think. There was somebody in the room earlier who left who said to me that they've done all this before, so they didn't need to stay for this. Now, that's fine, but for all of you, whenever you encounter somebody, you've not done it before. It's that person, it's that new experience, and it's good to have this set of things to think about so that we've got an awareness.
It's a hard question to answer.
It's a really hard question, isn't it? But it doesn't mean we shouldn't have a look at it, doesn't it? Yep, you're right. I think I heard that on this side as well. It's a really hard question to answer, but I would like to think that the church has a huge role to play in all of this, and that's why I do the job at the hospital but stay in the church, and it gives me a chance to say that's a form of ministry that's happening out in different places of work. Yep.
I just want to make just a brief comment that
Sure.
maybe the naming in the funeral service of the children and maybe the grandchildren, there's something about that.
Yep.
I'm speaking as a minister, but naming people,
Yep.
I find or get feedback that that's very helpful.
It is very helpful just to include in that way in the prayers or something.
The prayers.
Yep.
And you're praying for the people who are bereaved. Sometimes you just go for you could just go for the close, but I usually tend to want to name children and grandchildren, and sometimes even
Yep.
great-grandchildren.
Absolutely.
Because they may well be there.
And to say if they're not there, you will be mentioned in the service.
And
That would
those
be
that are
lovely.
still in Australia who can't come, so we're praying for them too.
So including and remembering the names of children, and can I just say as a wee stresser about how important that is, I have had 3 colleagues in the hospital recently, nothing to do with church, who don't know that I do church stuff in my other half of the week, who have told me about funerals they've been at recently where the minister or priest has got the person who died's name wrong. It's more common than you think. So there's good practice and there's very careless, thoughtless practice. And I always remember Tom Gordon, who's speaking today, when I was training for the ministry in my probation, Tom did a session about funerals as hospice chaplain, and he said, do you all do funerals? And we all said yes. And he said, do you do them well? Because there's nothing more important in somebody's grieving process than the funeral. It's such a huge step, and it's key to helping people to move on to the next bit in their grief. So funerals are incredibly important. So ministers, more power to you, and do them as well as you can, and other elders who are doing them, and elders who do the follow-up visits or support visits with the minister. It's a key time for listening to families, and if you get it right, it's so therapeutic and healing. So please, thank you for that comment.
They remember.
People do.
Get it right, they remember.
They remember.
They remember, oh, this person came to my house and told me, they remember you.
They don't forget. That's right. Absolutely. So the church has a key role to play, and I'm going to, again, I'm sorry about the time. I'll have to go through this quite quickly, but please do come and speak to us at the stall, and I'm more than happy to do follow-up training for anybody who feels they want. We've got a little sheet that Katie can take a note of your name. We can do follow-up training as well if people are interested. I want to talk just briefly, but in an important way, about the unique relationship between a parent and child. I know we can't always assume that's great, as we've said earlier on, but the loss of a child is a very particular type of grief. It's a very acute grief. Of course, all bereavement is difficult, but this is a little bit about how we can support bereaved families in general, but with a specific nod to thinking about families who have lost a child. What's key in dealing with bereaved families are relationships. If you know them already through the church, then that's great, because those relationships come into their own then. It's the chance for you to really show your caring, compassionate side, your thoughtfulness, your prayerful consideration of families, and to keep making the effort to keep contact with them, not to say, I left them on their own because I knew that that's what they would want. You don't know that that's what they want. Keep trying to make a connection with people. I find it really powerful that Child Bereavement UK is not just for people under 16 when parents lose a child under 16. We've got people who phone our support line and who come for sessions across the UK when an 80-year-old woman has lost a 60-year-old daughter. Because it's just a terrible, terrible loss to lose a child. No parent expects to outlive their child.
No.
So here's a few other thoughts about why that particular type of grief is very specific. And like we said about the babies on the engraved leaves earlier on, it's a lifelong loss. It's not something you ever get over. I was doing a training with some midwives recently, and one of the midwives said, how long will it be before the mums get over that? And we had to say, well, they won't. They'll learn to grow around it. You sometimes talk about the fried egg, that the yolk, the yellow bit is the grief, and the white is the life after that. But you always carry it with you. And anniversaries and particular triggers in society, things that go on. Halloween, really difficult for families who've just lost a child, thinking what they would have dressed up as, and Christmas, you know, what we would have done at Christmas. All of back to school, all of these times are huge triggers and really painful things for families who've lost a child or who had a baby that didn't live to be all those things that they hoped that they would be, the loss of the future that they were going to have with them. So these are messages from some of our families that we work with who've lost children, who've said what's made a difference to them. Acknowledging the loss. People say, I don't know the right thing to say, and I say, you can't really say the wrong thing if you say it from a place of authenticity and sensitivity. Because you can say to people, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to upset you or whatever. They'll be upset anyway. As long as you say something and you acknowledge that they've been through this huge thing, that's really important. Let them know that you see them and that you're there. But you don't know how it feels. You can imagine, but you don't know. Very quickly. Discussion point 3. Bereaved families, bereaved parents. What does this mean for the church? It's a hard question, but we're asking it 3 times. Very quickly, and then I'll bring you back just for the final bit. 2 minutes. Thank you so much for making a start with that question, because just even your willingness to engage with that is really important. It is a hard question, but I think, what does this mean for the church? It means lots of things. In my own ministry and my own experience in working with the families that I do, it means so much. There's huge opportunities to connect with faith and with support and pastoral care with families going through that. It happens at funerals, it happens in just getting people back into routine to come for a coffee, to your coffee morning that you do in the church every week, or back to groups. Think about going back to your routine. How we do it. We have a community cafe in our church where we have 60 volunteers, and out of those 60, there's probably been about 30 people who've been bereaved, who've lost children, you know, older people who've lost younger children in their 40s and 50s. And one of the big things has been about coming back to their volunteering that they do. We've got a huge role to play in supporting people who are bereaved. So thank you for engaging with the question. It's a hard question, but even if you just come up with some wee ideas and some wee ways forward that you can apply some of this, that would be brilliant and it would really help. The last bit in our last 5 minutes is just about saying thank you for doing this work that you do. There's wonderful work that goes on in churches and in schools and in clubs and groups and organisations that you're part of. You're really doing great things, and I'd want to encourage you to keep doing them, because the families that we work with tell us about all those wee chinks of light that come into their darkness. And they come from ordinary people just getting alongside them and being human with them. It's your humanity that makes a difference. We always say that to doctors in the hospital. You know, we talk about, you know, bedside manner. It's not about being professional and robotic and going in and this doesn't upset me. People don't want that. People want you to be genuine and human with them, and personal and real. Absolutely. But if you're going to do that kind of work, it's difficult. And so you want to take good care of yourself, because it does have an impact on you. And Tom Gordon again taught me about, if you go into people's grief with them and you sit with them and hear their stories, it leaves a trace on you. You come out feeling heavier yourself, and you need to do something with that heaviness. If you were at the self-care session Gabby was talking about, you contain things for people, and sometimes you go away carrying all this stuff that you've been containing for them, and you have to be able to take that somewhere. You take it to God in prayer, you take it to your supervisor or your group that you work with in a pastoral care team, and you try and maybe do something that helps you to shake it off with exercise or singing or whatever you do that helps you to feel a bit lighter. So let's look at finally the impact on you. Really important that you have good self-awareness, understanding your own emotions, having somewhere to express what's going on for you. Boundaries about your role. You don't have to do it all. You don't have to fix everything. You can only see so many people. If you've been carrying a lot with one family who are grieving, should you then go in and engage with a new family who needs support? Think about boundaries and think about ways to relax. Use your team network and life outside of work. I'm talking about pastoral care as an area of work and ministry, so make sure that you have things that you enjoy out with it where you can switch off. Because it's hard to witness. Touches on our own stuff. It's difficult work to do, but it's really important work. So, there's a bit about responsibility there. Take responsibility in asking for what you need. Do you need more training? Do you need a supportive team where you can offload supervision groups? All of these things are really important. What do you need? Who can you go to? Identify what it is you do, because you will have stuff that you need to take somewhere. This is the last bit. Just to say, we've got all this stuff, so if you are dealing with bereavement, and believe me, every aspect of bereavement, we've got stuff on our website about death by suicide, death by murder, we've got stuff about terrorist attacks, unfortunately, telling children frightening news, we've got things about pre-bereavement care, death of a baby, death of a sibling, death of a parent, all of these things. Child Bereavement UK is a tremendous resource, and if we achieve nothing else today, just for you to know that name and be able to Google it and get on that website is brilliant. When you go on the website, if you click on the Scotland flag, you'll find out about the development team training that's available for different staff teams, but also you'll find out about our two services in Glasgow, the hospital team and the Mary Hill team, that are working with the two sides of bereavement, bereaved parents and bereaved children. We also have an app for teenagers, which is this one here, so you can do, if you've got youth groups, that's something, a bereavement app. Please come and visit the stall. And remember that we do this work because we're very fortunate in the church and in our faith to have a bigger perspective about things. I can't tell you how soul-destroying it is to sometimes sit with families who have absolutely no faith or spirituality and who face a bereavement and the loss of a child and cannot begin to make sense of it or see a way through. We have something to offer because we have a bigger perspective and a bigger sense of a power beyond ourselves, and we know that we don't do this work alone. And even without putting that into words with people, when you sit with them, they get that sense. They know that it's okay because of the example that you live. You model something to them about faith and trust and hope and compassion, all the things of Jesus. So we hold this work in that prayerful way. And I will continue to pray for you and all that you do. And the last thing I wanted to leave you with is just that bit about why people appreciate what we do. So there's always something you can do. And thanks very much for listening. I look forward to speaking with you later.